My ex-husband found out I won $83 million in the lottery. He called me. "We can start all over again." I said, "Okay." He didn't know I had turned on a recording and called my lawyer, what I did to him next. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who stays too long. But I did. 6 years too long to be exact. His name was Derek Calloway. We met in Columbus, Ohio at a friend's backyard barbecue the summer I turned 28. He was tall, charming, the kind of man who remembered your coffee order and opened car doors, at least in the beginning. We got married 14 months later in a small ceremony at my mother's house in Bexley with hydrangeas in mason jars and my grandmother's lace tablecloth on the cake table. I was happy, or I thought I was. The cracks didn't appear all at once. They never do. First, it was the way he spoke to me when we argued, quietly, precisely, like he was filing a report rather than talking to his wife. "You're being irrational, Jennifer." That was his favorite line. He said it so often I started to believe it. Then came the small humiliations, correcting me in front of his colleagues at dinner parties, rolling his eyes when I talked about going back to school for my master's in education, suggesting, gently, always gently, that my friends were a bad influence on me. His mother, Sandra Calloway, was worse. She lived 40 minutes away in Westerville and treated every visit like an inspection. She once told me, with a smile that never reached her eyes, that Derek had settled when he married me. I laughed it off. I shouldn't have. By year 4, I had quietly shrunk myself down to fit inside the space he allowed me. I stopped calling my best friend Dana as much. I dropped the graduate school application. I worked my job as a school librarian, came home, cooked dinner, and tried not to say the wrong thing. When I finally filed for divorce in the spring of my 34th year, Derek didn't fight it. Not loudly anyway. But he made sure the process was slow, expensive, and humiliating. His attorney picked apart every joint asset we had. I walked away with my car, my savings, and a studio apartment on the east side of Columbus. He kept the house. That was 3 years ago. I rebuilt slowly. I reclaimed Dana. I started therapy. I got a small promotion at the school. And every Tuesday evening, almost out of habit, I bought a single lottery ticket at the BP station on Broad Street. A $6 quick pick. I'd been doing it since I was 22. I never won more than $12. Until I did. I remember the night clearly. It was a Thursday in February, cold enough that my breath fogged the bathroom mirror. I was checking the numbers on my phone while standing in my kitchen in socked feet, a mug of chamomile tea going cold on the counter. I checked them once, then twice. Then I sat down on the linoleum floor because my legs stopped working. $83 million. Ohio Mega Millions. My 6 numbers, all 6, in the exact order on my phone screen. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat there on the cold floor for a long time, very still, like my brain needed a moment to catch up with my life. I told no one that night, not even Dana. What I did do was call the Ohio Lottery Commission first thing Friday morning to confirm the claim process, and then, acting on some instinct I still can't fully explain, I contacted a financial attorney before I contacted anyone else. Her name was Carol Marsh, a small, sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in wealth management and asset protection. She told me to stay quiet, claim carefully, and trust no one until the legal structure was in place. I followed her advice precisely. The news broke anyway 6 weeks later. Lottery winners in Ohio are matters of public record, and a local news outlet ran a small piece with my name and the jackpot amount. I had already moved to a new apartment by then, under a forwarding address, with a new cell number. I thought I'd been careful enough. I had not accounted for Derek. His call came on a Sunday afternoon just as I was folding laundry. My old number, the one I'd had during our marriage, had been transferred to a Google Voice account that I monitored occasionally. His name appeared on the screen. I stared at it through 3 full rings. Then I pressed the record button on my voice memo app, and I answered, Jennifer. His voice was warm, warmer than it had been in years. I've been thinking about us a lot lately, about how good we were together before things got complicated. I think we gave up too soon. I really do. I think we could start over, start fresh. What do you say? I sat down on the edge of my bed. The laundry sat half-folded beside me. Okay, I said. Let's talk about that. He had no idea what had just begun. After I hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. The recording was 19 seconds. 19 seconds of Derek Calloway's voice, smooth as oil on water, suggesting that we start fresh. 4 days after my name appeared in the news as Ohio's newest lottery winner. 4 days. He hadn't called in 3 years. Not once. Not on my birthday, not when my father had his cardiac event, not to apologize, not for anything. And now, suddenly, he missed me. Suddenly, we'd given up too soon. Did he think I was stupid? Or did he simply not care whether I knew his reasons because he assumed I'd be too grateful, too lonely, too foolish to say no? That question sat in my chest like a stone for the rest of that Sunday. I made tea. I paced the length of my apartment, 12 steps from the kitchen to the window, 12 steps back. I looked out at the parking lot below, at the dirty February snow pushed into gray piles along the curb, and I thought about what 6 years with Derek Calloway had actually cost me. Not just the money, though the divorce had cost me plenty. His attorney had been thorough. We'd sold the house and split the equity, but somehow I'd ended up responsible for a credit card balance that had been mostly his, and walked away with significantly less than I should have. I hadn't fought hard enough. I'd been so desperate to be free that I'd accepted terms that were unfair just to get out. That was on me. I knew that. But the money was the smallest part. I thought about the graduate school application I never submitted, still sitting in a drawer somewhere, the early draft of what might have been a different life. I thought about Dana and how I'd slowly let that friendship hollow out because Derek made it easier to stay home than to explain where I was going. I thought about my therapist, Dr. Patricia Huang, who had spent 2 years helping me understand that what I'd lived through in that marriage had a name. It was called coercive control, not violence, not dramatic cruelty. Just a slow, consistent narrowing of who I was allowed to be. That had cost me more than money. That had cost me years. And now here was Derek, 19 seconds on a recording, ready to collect on all of it. The fear came that night, around 2 a.m, when I woke up and couldn't get back to sleep. It wasn't fear of Derek exactly. It was fear of my own impulses. Because buried under the anger, under the clarity, there was still a small, exhausted part of me that recognized his voice and felt something complicated. That part of me was dangerous. It was the same part that had stayed 6 years. I lay in the dark and made myself name it out loud, alone in my apartment. He doesn't want you. He wants the money. You know this. Don't let the other voice win. By morning, the fear had done something unexpected. It had made me angry in a clean, purposeful way, and that anger felt like the most useful thing I'd had in years. I called Carol Marsh first thing Monday. She listened to the recording without interrupting. Then she was quiet for a moment. "Jennifer," she said, "do you understand what this call represents, legally speaking?" "I think so," I said. "He's contacting me for the first time in 3 years, 4 days after my name was in the paper." "Which establishes motive," she said, "clearly and on record in his own voice with a timestamp." She paused. "Have you responded to him further?" "No, just the one call." "Good. Keep it that way for now. Don't answer, don't text, don't engage until we've talked through the structure." That conversation lasted an hour and a half. By the end of it, I had the outline of a plan. Not a revenge fantasy, not something reckless, something careful, something that would protect every dollar I had rightfully won, document every move Derek made, and ensure that if he was hoping to use reconciliation as a legal foothold toward a share of my assets, he would find no foothold at all. The first element was financial. Carol connected me with a trust and estate attorney who specialized in protecting assets from marital claims in Ohio. The key detail: the lottery ticket had been purchased and the win had been verified entirely after our divorce was finalized and all joint assets divided. Derek had no legal claim to my winnings, but Carol was cautious. "Predatory reconciliation is real," she told me. "If he marries you again, or if you establish a committed partnership in a legally ambiguous way, a smart attorney could make arguments. We need to make sure you are ironclad before you do anything." I agreed. The second element was personal. I told Dana everything that week. I sat across from her at her kitchen table in Clintonville with my hands around a coffee mug, and I laid it all out. The win, the trust fund structure still being set up, Derek's call, the recording. Dana is a practical woman. She didn't squeal or cry. She leaned back in her chair and said, "So what do you need me to do?" "Be my witness," I said, "and remind me whenever I start to doubt myself what things were actually like." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "I can do that." The third element was information. If Derek was going to approach me, I wanted to understand what his current life looked like before he did, not out of obsession, out of strategy. I hired a private investigator named Gary Trent, referred by Carol, quiet and professional, who spent 2 weeks building a financial profile of Derek Calloway. What Gary found wasn't surprising, but it was useful. Derek had a girlfriend. Her name was Melissa. They'd been together for over a year. He was behind on his car payments. He'd left the accounting firm where he'd worked during our marriage and was now doing freelance bookkeeping. He was not, by any measure, thriving. The picture was becoming very clear. I wasn't angry about Melissa. I was, if anything, relieved. It meant this wasn't even grief or nostalgia on his part. It was purely financial, which meant I didn't have to feel anything complicated about what came next. I wrote a single line in my journal that night. "He underestimated me once. He's making the same mistake again. This time, I'll be ready." The trust was established on a Wednesday morning in March. I sat in Carol's office on the 14th floor of a building downtown, signed my name 14 times across documents that were dense with language I'd spent the previous week learning to understand, and officially transferred the bulk of my lottery winnings, after the lump sum election and federal and state taxes, roughly $49 million, into an irrevocable asset protection trust. The trustee was a professional fiduciary firm. My name was nowhere on the public-facing documents. Carol had structured it cleanly. "How do you feel?" she asked when the last page was signed. "Like I can breathe," I said. It was true. There was something about having the legal architecture in place that changed the air in the room. I wasn't just a woman with money anymore. I was a woman with a structure and a team and a paper trail that documented every decision I'd made in good faith. Derek could do whatever he wanted. The walls were already up. What I didn't know yet was that walls visible to no one still make a sound when someone walks into them. I had continued to let Derek's calls go to voicemail. He'd called 4 more times over the past 2 weeks, each message slightly more personal than the last. The first was breezy and casual. The second mentioned that he'd been doing a lot of reflecting. The third, and this one I listened to twice, referenced a specific memory from early in our marriage, a weekend trip we'd taken to Hocking Hills, the way I'd laughed at a hiking trail that turned out to be far more difficult than we'd expected. He described it warmly, with detail. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. The fourth message said, "I know you've been busy, Jen, I understand, but I'm serious about this. I think we deserve a second chance. Call me when you're ready." I saved everyone. Gary Trent delivered his full report the same week the trust closed. He sat across from me in a coffee shop in the short north, a nondescript man in his 50s with a manila folder and no particular expression. He placed the folder on the table between us. "He's been asking around," Gary said. I looked up from the folder. "What do you mean?" 2 of his friends, guys from his old firm, were approached in the last 10 days. He was asking what they knew about lottery trust structures, whether an ex-spouse could make a claim on post-divorce winnings. Casual, supposedly. Just wondering. But both of them mentioned it to their wives, and one of the wives knows someone in Carol's building. He paused. Small city. I sat very still. He's researching it. He's researching it, Gary confirmed. He's trying to figure out if there's a legal angle. There it was. Not that I'd needed it. The voicemails were already damning in their timing. But this was different. This was Derek actively investigating his legal options, while simultaneously sending me nostalgic voicemails about Hocking Hills. The warmth was strategy. The memories were a softening tool. He wasn't calling because he missed me. He was calling because he was trying to figure out whether a reconciliation, even a brief one, might give him grounds to claim a portion of my assets. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not surprise, recognition. This was who he had always been, underneath the coffee orders and the open car doors. I just hadn't had the vocabulary for it when I was 32 and in love. I called Carol from the parking lot. He's doing legal research on spousal claims to post-divorce lottery wins, I told her. Gary has it documented with names. Good, she said, without missing a beat. That goes in the file. Everything goes in the file. The next move was mine to make, and I made it deliberately. I returned Derek's call that Friday evening. I had prepared for the call the way I might prepare for a difficult parent conference at school. Quietly, at the kitchen table, with notes I didn't need to look at but had written out anyway just to clarify my own thinking. I pressed record on the voice app. I called his number. He answered before the second ring, which told me everything about how anxiously he'd been waiting. Jennifer. The warmth was immediate. I'm so glad you called. I've been thinking about what you said, I told him, about starting over. I meant every word. His voice settled into something lower, more sincere sounding. I've had a lot of time to think, and I know I wasn't always. Were you ever actually unhappy? I asked. With us? In the marriage? A brief pause. Calculated, I thought. I made mistakes, he said. I think we both did. We both did. There it was. The gentle redistribution of fault. A technique I recognize now with the clarity of someone who had spent 2 years in therapy unpacking exactly this kind of language. I'd like to meet, I said, in person, talk things through properly. "Yes," he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "Absolutely, whenever you're ready." We agreed on the following Saturday afternoon. A coffee shop. Public. Neutral. My choice of location. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a moment, phone face down on the wood surface. Then I opened my laptop and emailed Carol. "Meeting set for Saturday. I'll have the recording." What do I need him to say? Her reply came within the hour, with a list. The coffee shop was called Stauff's on Grandview Avenue, a place I'd chosen because it had good natural light, a reasonable amount of ambient noise, and absolutely no sentimental history between Derek and me. I arrived 11 minutes early, claimed a table near the window, and ordered a black coffee I didn't particularly want. Derek arrived exactly on time, which was one of his habits. He was dressed carefully. Dark jeans, a gray merino sweater, the kind of studied casual that I knew took thought. He looked good. He'd always known how to look good. He smiled when he saw me, and I watched the smile carefully, the way you watch a thing you're studying rather than feeling. "You look great," he said, sliding into the chair across from me. "Thank you," I said. "Sit down." We talked for just over an hour. I had worn a cardigan with a front pocket, and inside that pocket, my phone was recording everything. I followed Carol's guidance precisely. I let Derek lead the conversation, redirecting only when necessary. He spoke about regret. He spoke about growth. He used the word us 14 times in the first 30 minutes. I counted. When I gently steered the conversation toward the future, toward practical matters, he was careful, but not careful enough. "I'm not looking for anything, Jen," he said at one point. "I just want to be part of your life again." "And what does that look like to you?" I asked. "Realistically." He leaned forward slightly. "Honestly, I think we get to know each other again first. Take our time. And if things feel right, eventually, maybe, we think about making it official again." "Official," I repeated. "Yeah." He held my gaze. "I know that's a big word. I'm just saying I'm open to it." Making it official. Remarriage. He couldn't have said it more clearly if he'd handed me a legal brief. I smiled, said I needed to think about things, and we parted with a hug on the sidewalk. He smelled like the same cologne he'd worn throughout our marriage. I noticed that. And I noticed that I felt nothing except a tired, clear-eyed calm. Carol listened to the full recording the following Monday. When it ended, she set down her pen. "That's everything we needed," she said. We filed a formal legal memorandum that week documenting Derek's approach, the voicemails, Gary's investigative findings, the coffee shop recording, as evidence of what Carol classified as predatory reconciliation intent. The memo was sealed in the trust file. It didn't go to court yet. It was a record, an insurance policy. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly Derek would figure out that something was wrong. He called 3 days later, and the warmth was gone. "I've been asking around," he said, "and I know you've set up some kind of trust. I know you've been talking to attorneys. What are you doing, Jennifer?" I kept my voice level. "I'm managing my finances, Derek. That's a normal thing to do." "Don't do that," he said, and there was an edge in his voice I recognized. The voice he used when he was losing control of a situation and beginning to reach for pressure instead of charm. "Don't play dumb. You know what I mean." "I don't think I owe you an explanation of my financial decisions," I said. He hung up. Sandra called 20 minutes later. Of course she did. Sandra Calloway's approach was different from her son's. Less charm, more authority. She had always believed that her position in Derek's life made her a stakeholder in his marriages. She spoke to me in the same measured, performative tone she'd used the day she told me he had settled. "Jennifer," she said. "I think you need to think very carefully about what you're doing. Derek is being sincere. You're making a mistake." "I appreciate your concern," I said. "He could make things very difficult," she said. "He has grounds, you know. A judge might look very differently at this situation than you're imagining." There it was, the threat dressed as advice. "Sandra," I said quietly, "I'm going to ask you not to call me again about this. If there's a legal matter you or Derek wish to raise, please have an attorney contact mine. Have a good evening." I hung up, walked to my bathroom, and stood at the sink with the cold water running over my wrists for a full minute. Then I called Carol and reported every word. The following week was tense. Derek sent 2 emails, one conciliatory, one accusatory. His attorney sent a letter to Carol's office suggesting they'd like to explore my lottery winnings in the context of ongoing financial entanglement during the marriage period. Carol sent back a 3-paragraph reply that was, she told me, the legal equivalent of a door closing firmly in someone's face. On Friday evening, I drove to Dana's house, ate leftover pasta at her kitchen table, and let myself be tired for the first time in weeks. Her kids watched a movie in the next room. The dog put his head in my lap. "You okay?" Dana asked. "I will be," I said. "I just need the weekend." I took it. Derek's attorney's letter had been a bluff, and Carol knew it before the ink was dry. The argument they were attempting to construct, that some portion of my lottery winnings might be traceable to financial activity during the marriage period, was, as Carol put it, creative but empty. The lottery ticket had been purchased with money from my individual account after the divorce was finalized and all marital assets had been legally divided and settled. There was no thread to pull. What Derek's attorney was doing was noise-making, issuing a letter formal enough to be intimidating, vague enough to be deniable, hoping I'd respond from fear rather than from strength. I had spent 6 years responding from fear. I was done with that. The temptation came that Tuesday. I was at work shelving returned books in the elementary school library when my phone lit up with a text from Derek's number, which I hadn't blocked on Carol's advice, precisely because contact was documentation. The text read, "Jen, I don't want this to turn into a legal thing. I never did. I'm sorry if my mom scared you. Can we just talk? No lawyers? Just us." I read it twice. I set the phone face down on the cart and kept shelving. This was the softer play, retreating from the legal threat and returning to the personal appeal. The implication was clear. Stop fighting, stop lawyering, come back to the table as just 2 people. No lawyers, just us. It was the same logic that had governed our entire marriage. Keep things private. Keep things between us. Don't bring in outside perspectives. Because outside perspectives had always made it harder for him to control the narrative. I didn't respond that day. I typed a reply I never sent, not to him, but into the Notes app on my phone, just to say what I actually thought. You don't want it to be legal because legal means records. Legal means I have proof. Legal means you lose. I saved the note. It helped. What helped more was the Thursday evening. My therapist, Dr. Huang, had suggested, months earlier, a support group for women navigating high-conflict divorce and post-divorce situations. I'd resisted at first. I'm not naturally a group person, and the idea of sitting in a circle talking about Derek made me exhausted before I even arrived. But I went, finally, on a Thursday night in March, to a meeting held in the basement of a church near German Village, with folding chairs and a coffee urn, and 6 women who each knew, in their own specific way, exactly what it meant to be underestimated by someone who was supposed to love you. I didn't say much the first night. I mostly listened. A woman named Rhonda, in her late 50s, had spent 3 years fighting an ex-husband who'd tried to claim a portion of a business she'd built entirely after their divorce. A woman named Camille, who was 37 and quiet and precise in the way she spoke, had navigated a custody battle in which her ex had systematically tried to paint her as unstable. A woman named Grace had simply come out the other side and was there to say, without sentimentality, it gets boring eventually. The drama gets boring, and then your life gets interesting again. I drove home with all the windows cracked, even though it was still cold, just to feel the air. That weekend, Dana came with me to tour 2 houses. I wasn't ready to buy. The financial structure was still being finalized, and Carol had advised against any major property purchases until everything was airtight. But I walked through both houses with Dana, stood in the empty kitchens, looked out the backyard windows, and let myself imagine something, a life that was entirely mine. No negotiating for space inside it, no apologizing for what I wanted, no shrinking. One of the houses had a library room, walls of built-in shelves, a window seat, afternoon light. I stood in it for a long time. "That room was made for you," Dana said from the doorway. I laughed. It was the first real, unguarded laugh I'd had in weeks. Derek texted once more that week, a single line, "I hope you're okay." I forwarded it to Carol's office without responding. Whatever he was watching for, a crack, a hesitation, a sign that loneliness or sentimentality had worn me down, he wasn't going to find it. The person he'd married, the one who'd stayed 6 years because she'd slowly stopped believing she deserved more, wasn't there anymore. I wasn't sure exactly when she'd left, but I was glad she was gone. They came together. I should have expected that. It was a Saturday afternoon in early April. I was at the coffee shop on Grandview, not Stouff's, a different one, a quieter one I'd adopted as a weekend workspace, when I looked up from my laptop and saw them walking through the door, Derek and Sandra, side by side. For a fraction of a second, I felt the old reflex, the tightening in my chest, the impulse to rearrange my expression before he could read it. Then it passed. I closed my laptop. Derek spotted me immediately. His face was arranged in an expression of careful openness, not quite a smile, something softer, more practiced than a smile. Sandra was beside him in a pale blue blazer, her reading glasses on a chain, looking like someone's respectable grandmother, and nothing else. "Jennifer," Derek said, reaching my table, "we were hoping to find you. Do you have a few minutes?" I didn't ask how he'd known I was there. Someone had told someone. This city, as Gary had noted, was small. I gestured to the chairs across from me. They sat. I kept my phone on the table with the voice memo running. I'd started keeping it open and recording whenever I was out in public as a reflex. Sandra opened the conversation. Of course she did. She was the better strategist, always had been. She folded her hands and looked at me with an expression that managed to be simultaneously warm and sorrowful. The expression of a woman who has been carrying a great burden of concern on your behalf. "Jennifer," she said, "I owe you an apology. The last time we spoke, I said some things that came out wrong. I was worried about my son, and I handled it poorly." She paused. "You've always been important to this family. I want you to know that." I waited. "We're not here with any agenda," Derek added. "No lawyers, no pressure. I just miss you, Jen, and I think my mom does too, in her way. We were hoping we could all sit down and talk like adults." Like adults. The phrase landed carefully, a small needle tucked inside a pillow. The implication being that lawyers and trust documents and recorded phone calls were somehow immature, that the adult thing, the reasonable thing, was to set all of that aside and have a conversation. "I appreciate you coming," I said, and then I was quiet. I'd learned, in therapy, that silence in these situations is a gift you give yourself and a trap the other person sets for themselves. Sandra and Derek were both accustomed to a Jennifer who filled silences, who rushed to smooth things over, who found the discomfort of unresolved tension so unbearable that she would accept almost any resolution just to end it. That Jennifer had done a lot of the work of managing their feelings for them. Derek began to talk. He talked about the early years of our marriage, about moments I actually remembered fondly, about a version of our relationship that had genuinely existed alongside the worse version. He was not entirely lying. That was what made it difficult to sit through. The warmth wasn't entirely invented. It never had been. That was always the hardest part. "I know things weren't perfect," he said. "I know I have things to answer for. But Jennifer, we could build something different now. A real partnership. Equal this time." "Equal," I said. "Yes." "Would a prenuptial agreement be part of that equal partnership?" I asked, pleasantly. The silence that followed was very different from the silence I'd let sit before. This one had a texture to it. Sandra recovered first. "I think that kind of thinking is exactly what keeps people from really being open to—" "Sandra," I said gently, "I'm not being closed. I'm being clear. If Derek is interested in a future with me, I think clarity is actually a good foundation. Don't you?" She looked at me differently then. The warm grandmother expression faltered, just slightly, like a channel switching. I saw the other thing underneath it, the real calculation, the assessment. And then it was gone again. "Derek has been through a difficult year," she said. "He's been rebuilding. He deserves support from the people who care about him." "He has a girlfriend," I said. The silence this time was absolute. "Her name is Melissa," I added, keeping my voice mild. "They've been together about 14 months, I believe." Derek's carefully arranged expression collapsed. It wasn't dramatic. He was too controlled for drama in public. But his jaw tightened and his eyes did something that they used to do when I caught him in a lie during our marriage. A very fast, involuntary look to the left. "That's—" he started. "I'm not bringing it up to be cruel," I said. "I'm bringing it up because I think honesty is the right foundation for a conversation like this. You'd agree, wouldn't you?" Sandra stood up. She smoothed the front of her blazer with both hands, a gesture I recognized from every family dinner we'd ever had. The gesture she made when a situation had stopped going the way she'd planned, and she was preparing to exit it with her dignity intact. "I think we've said what we came to say," she said. Derek stood as well. He looked at me for a moment, and what I saw in his face then was not warmth and not the controlled blankness. It was something rawer, anger, and underneath the anger, something that might have been a sliver of shame. "This isn't finished," he said quietly. "I know," I said. They left. I watched them through the window, walking side by side to his car. Sandra said something. Derek shook his head. I sat for a long moment, my hands very steady on the table. There was fear in my chest. I won't pretend there wasn't. "This isn't finished" was not a phrase meant to comfort me. It was a declaration, delivered quietly, by a man who was now out of other moves and beginning to feel it. Cornered people were unpredictable. I knew that. And Sandra, I suspected, was the more dangerous of the two when cornered. But the fear did something useful. It burned away the last traces of ambivalence. I picked up my phone and called Carol. "They came to see me," I said. "In person, together. I have it all on recording." Good, she said. We're going to need it. The meeting had been Carol's idea, and she had timed it carefully. 3 weeks after the coffee shop confrontation, with Derek's attorney having sent 2 additional letters, each slightly more aggressive than the last, each slightly less grounded in legal reality, Carol filed a preemptive motion in Franklin County Common Pleas Court. The motion requested formal judicial confirmation of the post-divorce character of my lottery winnings, along with a harassment and contact order based on the documented pattern of communication from Derek and Sandra since the news of my win had become public. In other words, we stopped waiting for him to make a move. We made ours first. Derek's attorney requested a mediation session before the court date. Carol agreed on my behalf to a single structured session, a room, a neutral mediator, both parties, and their counsel. I agreed because Carol told me to, and because I trusted her, and because the opportunity to be in a room with Derek and his attorney and have a neutral third-party witness, everything was not one to refuse. The session was held on a Wednesday morning in a conference room at a downtown mediation firm on High Street. The room had a long oval table, chairs in muted beige, a pitcher of water that nobody touched. I arrived with Carol, who was wearing a dark blazer and the expression of someone who had already won and was simply there to complete the paperwork. Derek arrived with his attorney, a man named Philip Reese, who specialized in what Carol called aspirational family law, claims that were more about leverage than merit. Sandra was not permitted in the room. That had been one of Carol's conditions. I had not seen Derek in a formal setting since our divorce proceedings 3 years earlier. He looked older, not badly. He'd always aged well. But there was something tighter in his face, something that hadn't been there before. Pressure will do that. The mediator was a woman named Dr. Ellen Favors, who reviewed the documentation before the session opened and summarized the positions of both parties without inflection. Then she opened the floor. Philip Reese, Derek's attorney, made his opening argument. It was, as Carol had predicted, a case built on implication and sentiment rather than law. He argued that during the years of our marriage, my pattern of lottery ticket purchases had been a household habit funded by shared marital income, and that the habit itself, not the winning ticket specifically, represented an ongoing joint marital activity whose ultimate outcome could reasonably be considered a shared marital asset. Carol let him finish. Then she opened her folder. The divorce settlement, finalized in April 3 years ago, explicitly resolved all marital assets, she said. Every account, every holding, every item of value that existed during the marriage was accounted for in that settlement, which Mr. Calloway's own attorney negotiated and which Mr. Calloway signed. She placed the settlement document in the center of the table. The lottery ticket in question was purchased 11 months after that settlement, with funds from Ms. Harmon's individual post-divorce earnings. The ticket was purchased in her name. The winnings were claimed in her name. There is no marital thread here. There is no legal theory that survives contact with those facts. Philip Reese began to respond. He used the phrase equitable interest twice. Carol asked him to cite the specific statute or precedent he was referring to. He cited a case from 1987. Carol opened a second folder and showed him the 2019 Ohio appellate ruling that had explicitly narrowed the interpretation of that statute to exclude post-divorce assets. I watched Derek during this exchange. He was watching Carol and Philip Reese the way a person watches a conversation that is happening in a language they almost but don't quite speak, understanding enough to know it was going badly. Then Dr. Favors, the mediator, asked Derek directly, "Mr. Calloway, You've recently attempted to re-establish a personal relationship with Ms. Harmon. Can you speak to the timing of those attempts in relation to the public announcement of her lottery win? It was the question that mattered most, and Derek had no clean answer because there was none. I had already been thinking about reaching out to Jennifer, he said carefully. The news may have encouraged me to act sooner than I might have otherwise. You're saying the $83 million lottery win accelerated your desire to reconcile, Dr. Favors said, not unkindly, simply precisely. I'm saying it, He stopped, started again. I have genuine feelings for Jennifer. Those aren't manufactured. 4 days, I said. Everyone looked at me. I hadn't spoken since the session opened. He called me 4 days after my name appeared in the paper, I said. He had not called, texted, or attempted to contact me in any form in the 3 years between our divorce and that phone call. Not once. Not on my birthday. Not when my father had a heart episode. Not to apologize for anything. Not for any reason. I looked at Derek directly. 4 days. Derek's jaw worked. He looked at Philip Reese. Philip Reese put his pen down on the table. I think we should take a short break, he said. But Dr. Favors was not finished. She had a methodical quality I appreciated. She did not let momentum go to waste. Mr. Calloway, she said, are you currently in a relationship with someone other than Ms. Harmon? The pause before he answered was 3 full seconds. I counted. There's someone I've been seeing, he said finally. For approximately how long? I don't see how. The question is relevant to establishing the sincerity of the reconciliation claim, Dr. Favors said in the same even tone. About a year, he said. 14 months. And you were pursuing reconciliation with Ms. Harmon simultaneously. It wasn't a question. Derek didn't answer it. He looked at the water pitcher in the center of the table, and his jaw was tight. And I watched the moment when a man who has spent a very long time being the smartest person in the room found out he wasn't. Carol placed the final document on the table, a printed summary of Gary Trent's investigative report showing the dates and nature of Derek's inquiry into Ohio spousal asset law in the 10 days following my lottery wins publication. Mr. Calloway was researching legal theories for claiming a share of Miss Harmon's assets, Carol said, while simultaneously sending her voicemails describing their Hocking Hills memories. She paused. We are prepared to present all of this before the court if mediation does not produce a formal agreement today. Philip Reese requested the break again. This time, Dr. Favors allowed it. In the hallway, Carol and I stood at the window that looked out over High Street. The April light was thin and bright. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter than triumph, a kind of stillness that came from having done a very hard thing with care and precision and watched it land. He's going to agree, Carol said. I know, I said. Philip Reese came back into the conference room after 22 minutes. He sat down, straightened his legal pad, and did not look at Derek when he began to speak. That told me everything. My client is prepared to formally acknowledge that Ms. Harmon's lottery winnings represent a post-marital individual asset, with no claim on his part, legal or equitable, he said. In exchange, we ask that the contact documentation be sealed. Carol set her pen down gently. No, she said. Philip Reese blinked. Excuse me? The documentation will not be sealed, Carol said. Ms. Harmon has agreed to pursue no further legal action against Mr. Calloway, provided he signs a full renunciation of any and all claims, present, future, or derivative, on her lottery winnings or any assets held in her trust, along with a signed agreement to cease all direct or indirect contact with Ms. Harmon and to have no further communication through intermediaries, including but not limited to his mother, Sandra Calloway. Philip Reese looked at Derek. Derek looked at the table. The alternative, Carol continued pleasantly, is that we proceed to the court date, at which point the voicemails, the recorded coffee shop conversation, the investigative findings, and the mediation record all become part of the public court filing. Public. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. I watched Derek absorb it. Derek, who had spent our entire marriage managing perception, his colleagues' perception, his mother's approval, the image of a man who was always measured, always reasonable, never wrong. Derek, who had built an identity on being the competent one. A public filing would include the recording of him describing our Hocking Hills weekend in a voicemail designed to soften me up, alongside Gary Trent's documented evidence of him simultaneously researching spousal asset law. It would include the mediator's notes about his 14-month girlfriend. It would include Sandra's phone call and her thinly veiled threat. All of it. Public record. He signed. It took another 40 minutes of legal review, but he signed. Every page. The full renunciation of claims, the no-contact agreement, his initials in the margin of the investigative report summary, per Carol's insistence, acknowledging receipt. Philip Reese was professional about it, which I respected. He was simply doing his job, and the job was now done. As they filed out of the conference room, Philip Reese extended his hand to Carol, which was the only genuinely sporting moment in the entire proceeding. Derek paused at the door. He looked at me. I don't know what he was looking for. Some flicker of softness, some acknowledgement of the history between us, some evidence that I still felt something that could be used. Whatever it was, I hope he didn't find it. Because what I felt in that moment was not anger, and not satisfaction, and not grief. It was completion, the feeling of a chapter that has been running past its end finally, properly closing. Take care of yourself, Derek, I said. He left without responding. Carol and I rode the elevator down to street level in comfortable silence. On the sidewalk, she shook my hand, a firm two-pump shake that felt like the period at the end of a very long sentence. You were exactly right throughout this process, she said. Every decision. I had good counsel, I said. You had good judgment, she said. Counsel just helped you use it. I walked to my car alone. It was noon on a Wednesday in April, and the city was doing what it always does. Buses, pigeons, someone on a phone call outside a sandwich shop. Completely indifferent to the fact that my life had just irrevocably changed. I called Dana. It's done, I said. She made a sound that wasn't quite a word but contained everything. Dinner, she said finally. Tonight. My house. I'm making the pasta you like. Yes, I said. I drove across the city with the radio on, the windows down, the afternoon light hitting the downtown buildings at the angle it only hits them in spring. I thought about the library room in the house I'd toured. I thought about Dr. Huang and Rhonda and Camille and Grace. I thought about my grandmother's lace tablecloth and the hydrangeas in mason jars at a wedding where I'd been happy in good faith. I thought about the Tuesday evening at the BP station on Broad Street, a $6 ticket, socked feet on linoleum, and the numbers that changed everything. And I thought, nobody gave me this. I earned the win. I earned the protection of it. And the person who tried to take it from me found out what happens when you underestimate a woman who has already survived you once. That night, Dana and I ate pasta and opened a bottle of wine that cost more than anything I'd ever bought before the lottery, and it tasted exactly like it should. I bought the house with the library room in June. It was a craftsman-style home in Bexley, 4 blocks from where I'd grown up. Wide porch, mature oak tree in the backyard, the built-in shelves I'd stood in front of and tried not to want to obviously. I spent 3 long, unhurried weekends arranging books the way I wanted them. I bought a reading chair, oxblood-colored leather, that I'd admired in a shop window for 2 years without ever walking in. I walked in. By fall, I'd launched a nonprofit literacy program for kids in Columbus's underserved East Side neighborhoods. I hired 2 part-time staff members, partnered with 3 schools, and secured a matching grant. It was the most satisfying professional thing I'd ever done. Dana and I had dinner every other Thursday. Her kids started calling me Aunt Jen. I went to Italy in September, alone, which had seemed frightening when I booked the flight, and was in practice extraordinary. Solitude, chosen freely, feels almost nothing like loneliness. When I eventually began seeing someone, a history teacher named Marcus, who actually listened to what I said, I moved slowly, on my own terms. It felt nothing like what I'd had before. As for Derek, Melissa left him 4 months after the settlement. He lost freelance clients. The reputation he'd spent years cultivating had a permanent dent. He moved out of Columbus in the winter. I don't know where. Sandra turned her attention to her other son's family, who reportedly found this exhausting. My mother came to see the new house and stood in the library room without saying anything for a long time. Then, "Your grandmother would have liked this room." I sat in the oxblood chair and cried a little. And then we ordered pizza, and it was one of the best evenings I can remember. I was 37, and my life was entirely mine, because I'd learned what it cost to give yourself away to someone who didn't know what you were worth, and that the right response to that lesson is not bitterness. It's building something that they never could have. Here is what I know now, that I wish I'd known earlier. The woman who stayed 6 years too long was not weak. She was doing the best she could with what she understood. But the moment she stopped explaining herself to people who weren't listening, that was the moment everything changed. What would you have done in my place? Would you have answered the phone? Would you have pressed record? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave your answer in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need it today. Thank you for being here. I'm grateful you listened.